Hi, everyone. Welcome. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. The participants are making their way in the moment to our wonderful virtual event, which I'm sure we're all very accustomed to by now. But as tonight is all about national issues, made sense for us to have it in this forum, and we're just so excited to have everyone here this evening. So again, welcome. Hi. If everyone wanted to join Kate in saying hi in the chat, let us know where you're zooming in from this evening. It'd be so good to hear from everyone and find out where you're coming from. We're up to about 24, which I think is good. We've got a bit of a tight 1 hour for this evening's panel. So I might actually just kick us off and let's get going. So hello and welcome to everyone joining us tonight for our Arts on the Agenda, putting arts and culture on the radar this federal election. My name is Georgie Cirillo. I'm a SAMAG committee member and I also work for NAVA in membership and advocacy. I'll be introducing tonight's topic and panel for you and then handing over to our wonderfully gorgeous and brilliant speakers. Tonight I am in my home on beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, where I both live and work. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples as the traditional custodians of this land and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and future. I extend that respect to all custodians of country throughout all lands, waters and territories, and to those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us this evening. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A quick intro about SAMAG. If you're new to us, we offer an annual program of events to share practical, inspiring and innovative ideas to grow an inclusive and resilient arts sector. Our monthly events are designed as professional development for artists and arts workers and encourage knowledge sharing across the sector. Please allow me to welcome our speakers for this evening's event. Jess Harwood is an illustrator, communications professional and environmental campaigner living on Gadigal land in Sydney. Jess uses her art, comics and info tunes to explain and drive people to take action on climate change and environmental issues, and has had her work featured by the BBC, ABC and in The Guardian. Miranda Donnelly is a mother, partner and proud Wiradjuri woman based in Meanjin, Brisbane, Queensland. Merindah is currently the executive producer of BlakDance and has worked across all art forms in market development at the Australia Council for the Arts. Kate Larsen is an Adelaide-based writer and arts and cultural consultant with more than 20 years experience in the not-for-profit government and cultural sectors in Australia, Asia and the UK. And our facilitator for the evening, Dr. Ben Eltham, is a lecturer in cultural and creative industries at Monash University. Ben writes extensively about Australian culture and politics for a range of media outlets, including The Guardian, Meanjin, Overland, and the Sydney Review of Books. So the budget is out and the federal election has been announced. How do we as a community get arts and culture onto the political radar? The impacts of the pandemic are far from over for our sector, but the budget plans to wind down COVID recovery initiatives. We continue to demonstrate the huge public value arts and culture bring to Australia, but that evidence and value continues to be misunderstood or ignored. What steps can we take to ensure the future of our sector? Our conversation tonight will speak to these issues, offer some campaign and policy insights, and hopefully inspire your own advocacy work during this federal election campaign period. If you have questions that pop up, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So please put them in the little Q&A function at the bottom and we'll try and get to as many as we can this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Ben now, who's going to kick off tonight's conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Georgie. A pleasure to be here, and thank you for your generous introduction. I also wanted to pay tribute to SAMAG, which has done so much great work in this space over a number of years now, and it's curated a bunch of interesting panels that I've happened to catch, and it's very much an honour to be able to be here to present and to facilitate tonight. I'm calling in from my shed, actually, which is out in western Victoria on Jabberong land. I'd like to echo the acknowledgement of country that's been made for my country that I'm calling in on. And look, I'd like to basically give you guys a bit of a quick rundown before we start tonight's debate. So as I'm sure everyone's aware, the federal election now has been called. The caretaker period is with us, and the federal leaders are jetting off to marginal seats around the country. And I see that Anthony Albanese's already had a gaffe. So it's an election campaign in full flight, and the media is highly engaged. Now, in an election campaign, of course, the media hijinks and the heat and the light can sometimes get overwhelming, and we can lose track of the policy debate. And that's probably never more so than in the arts and culture, which is never a policy area that gets a tremendous amount of attention when it comes to federal elections in the first place. So I think tonight's panel is very timely because it asks us all as a community and as an industry to consider what are the key issues running into this federal election. And so I'm really pleased to be able to try and get a bit of a discussion going tonight. Now, I'm going to try and facilitate in a fairly free-flowing and in a fairly discursive way, and I'm hoping that my guests will just jump in and start talking at any moment. I'm very pleased to be joined by Kate, Merindah, and Jess tonight. Three, as I'm sure you'll agree, three very eminent panelists, all with extensive experience in this sector and who've all done tremendous work in the Australian cultural space, both for their own communities and also reaching very, very important audiences. So it's a very, I think, a relevant, timely topic for us to be approaching tonight. What I thought I'd do just to kick things off is to go around the panel and just ask them, how are they feeling at the beginning of the election campaign? Do they feel like the issues in terms of our sector are being addressed? And if so, how would they like to see them actually be talked about? Maybe I'll start with Kate.
How am I feeling? It's really hard at the moment to feel anything but the perpetual despair. But we do have a budget, which I suspect, in my cynicism, is the closest we're going to get to any cultural policy promises from the current government. So it's essentially a de facto cultural policy and not a great one so far. So I am both dismayed on the one hand at that not only has the message thus far about the difficulties in the centre been ignored, but it's proposing to make it even harder. But in some ways, I'm also hopeful and grateful for the budget to provide something to advocate against and to start working from a strength position about what we actually need and lobbying from that, rather than arguing against what's potentially going to be cut.
Now, let me just pin you down on that quickly before I go to the other panelists. When you say advocating against, did you have any issues with the federal budget as it related to the arts?
Well, the perpetuation of what we're going into now, 8 consecutive years of federal funding cuts, not just directly funds to artists, but also the funding of the key artistic infrastructure, which have been decimated already and restructured within inches of their lives multiple times. So it's looking at a 20% further reduction after 8. This will be the 8th consecutive year. So yeah, I have many issues, and to do that off the back of this COVID period, where so many more people turned to artists, to art and artists to get through the last 2 years, during which time, as artists, our livelihoods were more precarious than ever before. actually seems to go beyond politicking and into cruelty, also, let alone all the nonsensical reasons why disinvesting further in the arts is bad for the broader economy and society and culture and health of Australia's people.
Merindah, how are you feeling?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I'm just joining the Zoom tonight from Meanjin here on Turrbal and Yagara homelands, and I just want to acknowledge their families, communities, elders and ancestors for caretakering for this country for over 3,000 generations. And it's why I get to Zoom in tonight from this beautiful place in Brisbane. So I would say I had a look at the budget, and I didn't. I could have this wrong, and I really hope that I do, but I couldn't see any money for First Nations cultural arts, culture and the arts, and that's in the face of the announcement and the refresh of Closing the Gap actually having, for the first time in over a decade, a goal in its refresh that addresses First Nations culture. So, you know, it wasn't really surprising actually to see that Closing the Gap now includes culture. However, it's not actually included within the budget. You know, I think that, you know, when I think about, well, why is that? It's really systemic. I think my personal belief is that it's a really systemic issue that we're talking about here when we're specifically breaking down that budget to look at First Nations culture and the arts. And you know, I guess the most logical explanation, you know, that I can come up with is that you know, since 1973. First Nations culture and artistic leaders have been meeting to gather and discuss and self-determine our future here in Australia about what is it that we want, what is it that we need, what is it that we can do as First Nations people around our maintenance, revitalisation and survival of our culture and art. And I'm thinking about you know, that 50-year journey since that first gathering of those cultural leaders, and I'm reminded of you know, the kind of the, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back that a lot of our struggle is faced with as blackfellas. For example, like there was a moment as part of that 50-year journey where ATSIC actually had a mandate and was supporting and funding, you know, committees on upholding and maintaining ICIP, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. And that was abolished, as we all know, under Howard. And then I'm reminded that, you know, there were other organisations and mechanisms in that 50-year journey that have attempted to, you know, organise and put forward a national position for First Nations culture and the arts, and that those things have almost gotten up and then they've fallen over, and they've almost gotten up and then they've fallen over. And so, you know, when I think about what is that really systemic issue that we're faced with, you know, I think that there's been many advances. There's still a lot of struggles that we haven't achieved, but there's been many advances around First Nations health and the legal services and the education departments. And I think about how all of those sectors have peak bodies and that their needs are represented when it comes to policies like Closing the Gap. And, you know, whereas when we talk about First Nations culture and the arts, there's not a peak body or a national representation that's organising what those goals need to be, and therefore there's not advocacy, lobbying, and campaigning happening at a national level for First Nations culture and the arts to have, a represented voice in policies like Closing the Gap. And I think that's why we've seen Closing the Gap not include culture, even though in Canada and New Zealand, those policies on Indigenous disadvantage do not separate culture from well-being. So I think that's why for a decade there was no, instrument within Closing the Gap that really married well-being with culture. And therefore, I think because Closing the Gap is failing the culture and arts sector for First Nations people, I therefore think that the budget, of course, is failing, and I'm very concerned about how would we contribute and be satisfied with a position as First Nations people that is truly self-determined within a national cultural policy if we can't even have, things like Closing the Gap servicing us.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Merindah. And you're right, there was no new funding in the federal budget for any First Nations cultural programs or initiatives. One of the several glaring issues of this year's budget. I imagine we're going to come back to the issue of peak bodies and representation and advocacy later in tonight's discussion. So hold that thought. I think that's a really important one. But let me ask Jess, how are you feeling, Jess?
Thanks, Ben. And Kate and Merindah, so great to hear from your experience as well. No joy from me about good feelings for the budget. I'm sorry. I'm not very involved. Like, I don't have my head around all the facts and figures. I understand there's a huge cut after 8 years of cuts. And yeah, it really does feel like, as an individual artist, it feels like salt being rubbed in a wound after 2 years of the pandemic, when literally if people didn't have the arts in the last 2 years, they would have been sitting in their houses with blank walls, with nothing to watch, with nothing to listen to, with nothing to do or read. So it really doesn't feel good. And from my perspective, I guess I'll be sharing tonight very much from my perspective as an artist and environmental campaigner and media strategist. But like, just looking at this budget, when the arts gets cut and fossil fuels subsidies goes up to $11 billion. It really shows the priorities to me of the government, where their priorities lie. And honestly, 11 billion to the arts, I think would be absolutely fabulous. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of more detail to share, but I can share from what it feels like as an artist to be seeing this budget handed down this year.
No, I think that's an absolutely important perspective. Can I ask, Jess, did you receive JobKeeper or any support during the pandemic?
I didn't. I work part-time, so I kind of focused a little bit more on building up my own maker practice, which I was in a fortunate position to do, but not all of my friends were like that, especially those who worked in, and had all their live performances cancelled time and time again. They've really struggled. It's been a really, really tough time, not only financially, but the mental health impacts of that on someone who has dedicated their whole life to their art. And then just having that ripped away, during that time, and then being felt this budget's very much reinforced the feeling that if you're an artist, your practice is not valued. But, obviously people do want it. They do want things to experience and watch, and ways to participate and express themselves. But when it comes to actually being able to have time and funded projects to work on, it really shows that the government's not happy to not filling that space.
Yes, I do think it was one of the ironies of the pandemic was that the same time that particularly the performing arts and any of the cultural practices that are exposed to, health restrictions were hammered, really badly damaged by the pandemic. At the same time, we saw an amazing uptick in people's engagement and participation with cultural pastimes. You know, people taking back musical instruments up, people dancing at home. You know, a lot of, you know, just everyday participation going on for people during the pandemic, and yet, you know, very little recognition of the people and the sector that is involved in delivering those cultural practices. I mean, Merindah, I mean, you run a small to medium performing arts company, right? You know, how are you guys climbing back from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky we got a rise. In fact, we as an organisation, we've done quite well during the pandemic. We've been maybe one of the few kind of you know, good news stories, a little bit like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And I would say that, you know, that hasn't actually continued. It was a one-off moment, I think, because of the RISE funding that we did receive. And, you know, we were unfortunate to only receive 25% of our state-based multi-year funding request. However, you know, as an organisation, you know, we've been around now for over a decade, and I'm proud to say that we're growing from strength to strength. Part of our mandate, though, at BlakDance is also to grow a small to medium First Nations contemporary dance sector. And, you know, in the last 6 months, we've had choral projects receive multi-year funding. We've had Joel Bray receive multi-year funding. Jacob Boehm in Victoria has received multi-year funding. So, you know, we're doing our job where we really are putting our money where our mouth is and walking the walk. But I guess the thing that's a little bit disheartening is that what we're seeing is the funding for the arts decreasing, but the activity that we're investing in increasing. And so, you know, there's a pretty big imbalance going on in terms of what we're doing and in terms of what the output of the sector is, and in terms of the decreasing funding pool. So, you know, it's scary actually when we think about, you know, what is the future, you know, and especially for First Nations contemporary dance is really only, particularly in independent and emerging small to medium space, it's only just starting to be visible. It's, you know, we're on the cusp. So, you know, how do we grow if the funding's decreasing? You know, it doesn't compute.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, we're fighting for an increasingly small pie, and we're trying to slice it up in fairly thin slices. Kate, how was your pandemic? You know, how did you manage to get through?
So my creative practice is as a writer, but that all but evaporated during the pandemic because of the level of panic. So as I took on more and more work without those creative practice days, I work as a freelance arts consultant, so I help people, other people run their arts organizations now rather than running them myself. And I've always thought that gives me an amazing and unique snapshot of the preoccupations of the sector, because I'm working with 15 different organizations at once. And so it was an emotional roller coaster tracking that, from, you know, general panic to very focused financial panic to this thing's going to last a little while. Let's get some house in order, do those things that we could never have time to do when we're delivering our programs, to there's a very specific rise bump. So lots of financial planning and fundraising throughout. to everybody realizing none of their strategic plans made sense anymore in this new world that we find ourselves in, to being 2 years worth of exhausted and it's still going on. And that bump that you were talking about, Merindah, I've seen in so many organizations. So the stopgap solution, so first job keeper, was obviously amazing for those who got it. I didn't get any sick leave when I got COVID. And I did so from a position just recognizing my privilege that I was able to stay safe and well and not go into too much financial panic during that time. And so many people, as Jess was saying, did. But then that at the end of that first financial year, so many organizations was having end of financial year panic because all of a sudden they had unexpected surpluses that they had to justify to their members and funders. So then a second round of funding came in from RISE, so people had project-based boosts. Although it had nothing to do with COVID right back at the beginning, we also saw the change of the Australia Council multi-year funding, which saw many organisations defunded. They had a transition year, they had one more year of funding and a transition year. So the impact of all of those changes, those shrinkings, the cash flow fluctuations, and a number of people losing their federal funding, which was again due to those 6-7 years at that point, years of government support being withdrawn from the Australia Council, is really just starting to hit now. So this is the year where we're starting to see some closures and some mergers of across the sector, and at a local level, at a grassroots level, artists unable to continue practice, which is devastating on so many counts.
Yeah, I feel like that's a side of the pandemic that I feel has been under-recognised, particularly outside of the cultural sector, which is that while everyone out there maybe, there's certainly a media narrative that we're through the pandemic, you know, the infection rates would tell you a different story. But certainly there's a view, particularly from a lot of our political leaders, that, you know, we've made it through, you know, we're out the other side. It doesn't actually feel like that from the people that I'm talking to in the cultural sector. I know I'm down in Melbourne in Naarm. There's a lot of venues and small to medium organisations just hanging on by their fingernails. There's a lot of delayed pain, you know, like you mentioned, Kate, of things working their way through the system. You know, and there's just a lot of areas that never got any stimulus or any support. And I can tell you, as somebody who works at a university, you know, this sector in particular, in the university sector, which does have cultural flow-ons, because a lot of people worked at universities teaching, for example. Well, a lot of those jobs dried up. Something like 35,000 jobs were lost in higher education in 2021, which is an astonishing figure, actually. So I was going to go around the panel again and ask, you know, how, maybe I'll go back to Jess, you know, is this the kind of story that you're hearing from some of your colleagues and partners and friends? Yeah,
absolutely. You know, from, you know, my mate who's an opera singer who works at Coles now. And, you know, there's definitely, there's a squeeze. Like as a visual artist, I kind of, during the pandemic, I kind of upped my maker, you know, things that I was selling to people via Instagram. But like people are also not in a financial position to buy art, I think, and especially increasingly so, you know, petrol prices, inflation, all the rest of it. It's just not something that they're putting money aside to purchase. So it does feel like a more difficult space. And, you know, I'm in a very privileged position where I have like another job, which potentially, you know, I could focus or double down on. But, you know, not all of my mates are like that. And it's just such a heartbreaking thing as well to have to contemplate giving up this part of your life to be a bit more pragmatic and get another job, you know. And also I worry about the impact that that's having generally on society, you know. Are we losing the ability to record our stories, to you know, delve into different aspects of Australian life, and you know, by actually just this area drying up, it's a worry, and it's not something I think that you can immediately put your finger on, that you can't immediately see that, but I think we might feel the long-term effects if it continues. Yeah.
What do you think, Merindah? Is that, how's your read on the sector at the moment?
Look, you know, this is by no means representative, okay? What I'm about to say, it's what I've experienced. And you know, when COVID first hit, we BlakDance ran a lot of Zooms. You know, there was a lot of sort of support group kind of Zooms and gatherings for artists to join, to just sort of, so we adapted really quickly. I think I've spoken about this before, actually, on the SAMAG panel previously, but we adapted the process of inviting elders into those spaces to open and close those meetings, because, you know, often they were quite heavy, as psychologically and emotionally people were sort of grappling with the situation and trying to understand what was going on. And what was really wonderful about that was that there was some elders who joined, and this is coming from different elders, right? Who, you know, invariably in one way or another said, you know, like, buckle up. You know, things have always been unstable for blackfellas since colonization. The last 250 years have been uncertain. There's never been anything certain for us. And there's nothing new about this situation. So slow down and go responsibly and go respectfully. But, you know, get used to it, because this is what the generations before you experienced for the last 250 years. And so it was there's been this kind of, you know, this really kind of interesting process where, like, we ran a survey at BlakDance with Ilbidgery, with Muglin, with Yuriyakin, I think Marrageku, and it was a well-being survey. It was at the top of COVID, and we got a fair few responses across the independent dance and theatre sectors, and some of the amounts of money that independents lost in the first few months, you know, were staggering. There were artists who lost their livelihoods. There were artists who lost their houses, their places of where they would, you know, live, eat, sleep. There were artists who lost their dreams. In particular, we were hearing that, you know, the cultural dance groups were just completely losing everything, because it was around the times of NAIDOC, and you know, we're also hearing that a lot of First Nations artists just weren't applying for JobKeeper because it was, you know, there's so many barriers around Centrelink, you know, before you even add in the kind of bureaucratic, you know, layering of all of what was going on with JobKeeper. So, you know, we were aware of the really immediate impact on artists, on cultural dance groups, on cultural practitioners. We were aware that it was devastating. We were aware that JobKeeper wasn't necessarily working. But I guess what we're hearing now as well is that for a lot of artists, you know, things kind of got postponed and delayed and postponed and delayed. And then this year, for some artists, has been an absolute, like, peaking of, you know, everything that had been postponed. And so what we're hearing from a few artists is that they've got burnout and they're not coping, and it's just all too much, and everything's due all at once, you know. So there's this kind of, you know, from one end of the extreme to the other end of the extreme, you know, going on, that's not really any better for people's mental health than the cancellation of everything, you know.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, one of the things that I'm hearing from some of the venues, for example, and festivals, is that there's a skills shortage now. So many people have left the industry, understandably, because they couldn't get work. But now it's very hard to get people back because they're working in, other industries, maybe getting a salary or working in an office job or whatever. So there's a reluctance to come back to a precarious, risky industry with, not necessarily the greatest working conditions, even in the good times. And I think that's also something that the sector needs to face up to. Just a little bit of housekeeping, because we're sort of halfway along. I'm going to open it up to questions in a little bit. So if people want to ask the panelists any questions, we're saying to people use the Q&A function on the Zoom. Look, I'm sure people will also throw some questions into the comments, into the chat, and that's fine too. But if you could use the Q&A, then I can then pitch those questions back on to the panelists. Yeah, I thought maybe I'd return to Kate now. I mean, is some of those things that Jess and Merindah mentioned there, are they chiming with what you're experiencing?
Absolutely. And something, Jess, you said earlier about the reason those people are leaving the sector in droves is twofold. One, it's so much harder to make a living, and it was already pretty hard before COVID. But then the message that we keep getting from government, and not just the government of the day, actually, but across the board, is, as Jess was saying, that we're not valued. Our work isn't valued, and that's in spite. I mean, we do have a data issue in Australia, in that subsequent governments have cut many of our cultural data collection tools, but and arts organisations aren't supported to measure their own impact beyond the end of a project funding period. But in spite of that, we do actually have a wealth of information and evidence as to how the arts contribute on so many different metrics to the economy, to health and well-being, to education, to our understanding of Australian identity, so that it feels like we're valuable but not valued for it. And that's where I think the cynicism comes in, because we do have the data, and yet, I mean, that data could be better, but we do have an evidence base, and yet that information and our messaging, what we're saying and how we're saying it, is being faced at best with disinterest and at worst with disdain. And that's where I think we're trying to get to with conversations like these, is to start steering what we say and how we say it, so it actually makes a difference.
Now, that's an excellent segue, and thank you for that, Kate, because you remind me that we are here also to talk about advocacy and how to get the message out there. And indeed, Adrian from the committee has also asked a very similar question, and indeed Sarah in the chat has asked that. So let me sort of ask those two questions and put them to the panel. So Adrian says, would love to hear about what the panel's suggestions are in terms of what great advocacy and engagement looks like during this election. And Sarah says, I think a similar question, is the best solution to a better future a greater political advocacy in the sector? So let's turn to that question now. It's a tricky one. Maybe I'll ask Jess, because Jess has got a bit of a background in advocacy and has done some campaigns. So what do you think, Jess?
So many ideas. Goodness. Yeah, I think we can really draw some lessons from, the organising work in social movements elsewhere. I've worked on some climate campaigns, and there's some pretty tried and tested sort of organising things we could do. I mean, we're quite a well-connected network of artists. So, I mean, I know Narva has the hashtag Vote for Art, was it Vote for the Arts campaign, which has an awesome set of policy asks. You know, how do we get that trending? Reach out to influencers to start a conversation about getting better arts funding. Would, you know, be one of the #1 things. And like, I keep thinking in media and climate campaigning land, sort of doing stuff in real life, being on the streets, you know, we could have some really fun, creative sort of campaign protests, best painted placards ever, I bet we could do. And that sort of stuff is actually, I think, personally, is very important, because it actually shows that we're kind of committed and we're ready to kind of show up and fight for this. There's a whole lot of, you know, we obviously would need sort of maybe like a unified campaign for that. But I keep thinking, like, I did work in New South Wales Parliament once, and I can't remember what it was, but we were launching something not to do with the arts on the same day that there was this was about a decade ago, there was a protest about stripping arts funding happening outside New South Wales Parliament. And dare I suggest it, but there was a bit of nudity. There were some life drawing models who had got their kit off because they were showing the arts was being stripped bare. And of course, you know, the media went like a moth to a flame to that, to take the photos of the naked folks outside Parliament. And our launch didn't get any coverage whatsoever. So just, you know, the value of a exciting, interesting media stunt or event, I think is really, it's really important to do those sort of things. Like, there's so many we've got so many creative brains, we could come up with something really fabulous, I think. But I just don't think you can beat that. But then also, just one last thing, this kind of slow organizing work that might need to be done with getting people to contact their local candidates and contact their local MPs and get them to commit to raising arts funding, you know, even if it is like local arts in the local arts community. Like, that sort of work, I think, is really important ahead of the election. And, you know, we're a very spread out bunch. We could probably contact everyone in every electorate to be able to do that. So some of those organizing sort of methods from social movements, I think we could probably import into this campaign. And just want to acknowledge the amazing work Narva's already doing, and you know, and don't want to say that this isn't already happening, you know, because it is.
Can I jump in? I just wanted to, I totally agree with you about that unified campaign message, but of course, one of the challenges we have here in Australia is that we don't have we have a problem of peaks. We have many peak state and national peak bodies. We have a newly re-emerging informal association of national peaks starting to reform after being after disappearing a few years ago. But it does mean that we're speaking with lots of voices and with lots of messages and with lots of different art form or location or community specific interests. And that's amazing. Like, we don't have to, like, there is strength in our diversity as much as there is strength in our unity. We don't have to agree, but it does mean that when we're lobbying those politicians, and you should certainly check out, like, do the Vote Compass, look at the Fund the Arts campaign score sheets to find out if you're in a marginal electorate, and if you are right, speak, do what you can to add your voice to those conversations. But without that kind of peak of peaks, there's no way of having a unified message and so we're just bombarding them with a visual arts argument and a performing arts argument and literary argument. But I think there are some big things we can all get on board with, those supporting an independent peer-led funding decision-making model like the Australia Council, and supporting the ABC. In addition to contacting our representatives, I also just wanted to mention that One of we've got so many plans and proposals about cultural plans out there in the moment and not many actual proposed cultural policies, which we hope they will follow. But one of them, from a new approach, identified that at a grassroots level, the arts have a branding issue. The very fact that we call it the arts is alienating for some people, and people don't associate it with it, even when they listen to music and watch TV and go to the movies and everything else that they do on a daily basis. Over 80 to 90% of us engage with the arts on a daily basis, but many people don't think about it as the arts in the same way that we don't say the sports. So I think there's a little bit of individual grassroots advocacy we can do with our own networks. So people who we know do all those things, but who would never think about that engagement as the arts, or people who care about us and want us to be able to make a living and want us to be able to have a living wage and have some superannuation when we retire. Those kind of grassroots local conversations. So if we all work out using our reading and our score sheets, who we think will support those, and then have little localized campaigns around our networks as well.
Merindah, what do you think?
Yeah, well, Kate, 15 of those peak bodies did come together, and we did go through a process, a facilitated process to come up with the campaign, Arts is Everywhere and Arts is Essential. And, it would be really good, actually. This is a call to action for everyone here and listening to get behind that campaign and to start using that hashtag, because, you're right. And, your approach is right. And all the elders that I talk to on a regular basis are right when they say, make sure that that we say cultural arts and not the arts. Because a decade ago, the founder of BlakDance actually estimated that there'd be at least 100,000 cultural Indigenous dance practitioners, practicing. And so, what are we doing when we're not actually recognising that in, the budget and multi-year funding and project-based funding and all of the systems that are set up that are not recognising that. And that goes for cultural dance from all people's different backgrounds,
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Whether an overarching national advocacy body would necessarily create better advocacy. There's an argument that it would, but coming from the union movement, I can tell you there's quite a few people who aren't particularly happy with everything the ACTU does, right? And I can tell you there's a lot of farmers who aren't always happy with what the Farmers Federation puts out there, right? So a national advocacy body can be a double-edged sword. I just would be interested to hear what the three panelists think about that idea.
I have some cynicism. I think it's so wonderful that the Arts Peaks are coming together again, but that's a model that's been tried before, and so it's cyclical, as so often so much of our sector is, especially in the small to mediums, is dependent on the passion and hard work of people who are not barely resourced for their core programs, let alone for the advocacy on top of that. And that's true at state and federal peak level. There's a lot of conjecture around whether redirecting, it's a very hard thing to fund. There's a lot of conjecture about whether public funding should go into supporting it. And there's also a lot of conjecture about whether the Australia Council should actually be allowed to do that role, to hold that role, that advocacy space for the whole sector on our behalf, in the same way that, obviously there's been a lot of, the Australia Council has been similarly deprioritised over the last 8 years of cuts, and I think they have had to tread very carefully as a result. But when you see the difference in the advocacy they are or aren't able to do, as opposed to comparable organisations like Sport Australia that are funded in a similar way, Sport Australia can speak back to government much more firmly. So I think we've potentially we have a structure already in place that's about actually refocusing our expectations and empowering the Australia Council to be that voice for us, rather than creating something entirely new.
When I think about this kind of stuff, I personally think about it from a human rights framework. You know, Australia signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2009, which clearly states that and this is what the Australian government signed up to, that it's a fundamental human right for Indigenous people to practice culture, and so, when we think about that, and we think about the position that we're in, where there's still children being taken away, there's still significant trauma from stolen generations, there still has been no formal negotiation about any kind of conversation around treaty. We still don't have our land to practice our culture, to undertake our cultural, activities, including dance, including song, including ceremony. Of course, it's no wonder that creating some kind of national body for some kind of, arts and cultural peak body, or cultural arts peak body, isn't high on the list of priorities when there's still Aboriginal people being killed in custody. That deaths in custody is something that's still going on. Our children are still being taken away. There's still been no formal negotiations around land back and treaty. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, what kind of organisation it is that delivers or rolls out the kind of advocacy that we need for First Nations culture and the arts. Whatever the structure, whatever organisation is going to do it, I think it just needs to be done as a fundamental human right for all of us to practice culture. So I don't care what form it comes in. Let's just get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with you on that, Merindah. I think, we spin our wheels a lot trying to come up with the perfect structure, and maybe what's more required is just some grassroots action from time to time as well. I've been doing a fair bit of it myself, actually, just trying to get into the media as much as I can and just try and push some messages around cultural funding. But I think that does raise an interesting question, and maybe this is sort of maybe my penultimate question, which would be, what is it that we need to do? What is the advocacy that needs to happen? What does that look like, and what should be done by whoever it is? Maybe I'll go back to Jess on this.
Ooh, what a big question. All right, I'm going to come up with the answer. No. I guess, from my perspective, I always just go back to what has worked in other social movements. And I think, that grassroots organising is really key. It would be great to have a peak body that that could run an umbrella campaign. That would be fabulous too. But I agree, if that's hard to achieve, then I think we just have to try whatever we can. And grassroots campaigning is really something that's available to a lot of us personally. I guess from my perspective, I sometimes think, I look at not the opposition, but, you know, in a climate space, look at the Minerals Council and kind of, they've done this great job at defining what a real job is in Australia, right? To the point where the Australian Institute found that most people think there's more jobs in coal mining than the arts in 2019. And there's actually way more jobs in the arts than there is in coal mining. And so I think there's some lessons to be learned from what the Minerals Council does in talking up mining and making people think that every single thing, you know, comes from mining. And, you know, I think it's not hyperbole for us to say, you know, to talk up, really emotively talk about how essential art is. And we have some really well-placed people who could do that for us. But yeah, it is quite complex. I think it needs like a number of approaches: grassroots, you know, leveraging the celebrities, doing some in-person actions and stunts that get media. You know, I think if we could do all of them, then that would maybe get us a bit further along. But yeah, absolutely acknowledge that it is a really big question and tough thing to do. And to acknowledge that it's really tough to think about this as an artist after 2 years of the pandemic and while you're just hanging on by your fingernails. Like, that is really tough. But yeah, kind of, Merindah, thank you so much for sharing what your elders have said to you, because I think like that really made me acknowledge my privilege, and actually I do have a bit more resilience to be able to work on this. And thanks also for raising that this is actually a human rights issue. That gives me a little shot in the arm to like keep going, as it should for all of us.
Thanks, Jess. We're just going to quickly jump in just there on the human rights thing, just very quickly. Not only is Australia a signatory to the convention that Merindah mentioned, we're also a signatory to the International Convention on Cultural Diversity, which I think gives us some really interesting tools and angles to look at cultural policy with, and is not looked at a lot in the Australian context.
Also the Convention of the Rights with People with Disabilities as well.
Certainly, and that's another really important one. So yeah, I mean, these international treaty obligations actually do impose obligations on Australia that in some cases we don't meet. So I think it's a really good point that Merindah and Jess have just brought up. I think we have a few minutes left to us. Kate, would you like to maybe, you know, make a finishing statement about what we've kind of been talking about tonight? Or I can also ask another question from the Q&A is another option.
I guess I just want to stress that there's so many smart brains that are out there doing wonderful things in this space and lending their energy to then implementing it. As I said before, we do have a complex and potentially contested space where our colleagues, where we're competing now in a very non-arts way with our colleague organisations and our community for this diminishing level of funds. I think none of us, that there is, we're still as a sector portrayed politically as this handout culture, but I think we really need to reframe that and come from our strength position. We as a sector provide so much across all of those metrics, and actually, in spite of our diversity, we as a sector agree on some of the tenets of the big picture policy items. And in fact, the thing that all three major parties agree on, first and foremost, is that First Nations cultural practice. They certainly agree in rhetoric, not yet in promises, and certainly not, as Merindah was saying, in the budget. But then there is consensus around the importance of Australian stories, which would lead to, a logical assumption that supporting the ABC as one of the key ways of telling those stories would be sensible. There's an increasing drive, and Ben, I think you wrote about this around the parliamentary inquiry, around increasing that equity of access for all, so regardless of where you are, locations, what art form you're working with, how you engage with the arts, and increasingly around that value of our cultural labour, and that we can't go on with this precarity indefinitely. And if we lose that, if we lose this how much poorer our society will be as a result.
Merindah or Jess, I'll give either of you the last word if you want to jump in and grab it. No, you. I can just nominate someone.
Yes, I spoke a lot. You have this one.
All right,
I feel like
Jess,
I spoke a lot.
You've been nominated. All right, here we go.
Okay, here's my key takeaway from working on social movements, and that is when things get so bad that you actually get angry, it's a very motivating feeling. It's much more motivating than despair. So I feel quite passionate and like angry about the state of funding of the arts in Australia and the struggle that everyone is going through. And so that is a super motivating thing. So I'm excited for those nude protests, I guess, that we're all going to organise now.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to end nude protests. I can't think of a more appropriate way for us to wrap up this very serious conversation. I'm afraid that I wasn't able to get around to everyone tonight, but I am conscious that I don't want to sort of drag people's evenings on too late, and I'm sure people have all got other things to get on with in their lives. There were a few questions that I didn't get quite around to answering. Adrian's asked me to tell us about the advocacy campaign that I am involved in. I'm involved in a kind of informal campaign called Fund the Arts, which is literally just trying to campaigning for more funding for the arts and for culture in all of its guises. And if you want to check out some of that stuff, you can find that on their website and some of the writing that I've been doing. I did a big research report last year for the Australia Institute. But it's not about me. It's actually about everyone here in this Zoom, I'm hoping, who's going to actually go out there and get those messages about the arts being essential and everywhere out into their communities and their electorates. I hope that this is a panel that's encouraged us to try and get more democratically engaged in a very important election. I think we can all agree on that some very important future scenarios for our country are opening up or perhaps being closed off by the outcome of the vote on May the 21st. Let me close tonight by firstly thanking our panelists, Kate Larsen, Miranda Donnelly, and Jess Harwood. You've been a delight to moderate and you've been intellectually stimulating as well as morally inspiring. So I think that's been very, very helpful to all of our audience, and certainly it's been encouraging for me as a moderator. Thank you to the SAMAG crew for another important panel. The work that SAMAG does, I think, is really, really valuable. I think we need some of these management advisory, advocacy groups in some other cities as well. We need a MAMAG. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Look, thank you to Sasha, who helped organise tonight's panel. I'm also advised that there'll be a follow-up panel to tonight at some stage in the election campaign. Hasn't been set down yet, and we haven't got the panelists organised, but watch this space, as they say. Look, I don't know if I have too much more to say. I'm sure everyone here is very contactable if you'd like to contact people individually. I'm always very easy to get in touch with, so please do that. I'll just, finally say thank you once again to Jess, to Merindah, and to Kate. Thank you for all your hard work and your advocacy. That's about it from me. Everyone have a really good night, and I'll see you on the election party on May the 21st. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see some friendly names in the chat too.